So today we're learning Daf Kuf Zayin, Masechet Psachim. We have been just learning about whether one is allowed to eat or even taste anything before saying Havdalah or before saying Kiddush. We've been learning we're learning that for quite some time. And now we're going to come to some kind of conclusion of that discussion today. And we're starting at the bottom of Kuf Vav Amud Bet, the bottom of 106b, and the words have followed. It goes as follows: Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Shmuel. Rav Yosef says in the name of Shmuel, he says, Ta'am eino makadesh. If you can taste any food at all before making kiddush, then you should not make kiddush. V'ta'am, and if you've eaten any food at all before havdalah, then again you should not be making havdalah after that. Now, it turns out that there's a difference of opinion because we have also Rabbah. Rabbah Amar Rav Nachman. Rabbah says in the name of Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel, in the name of Shmuel. Both these opinions are in the name of Shmuel. He has a difference of opinion. He says, Ta'am Makadesh, Ta'am Avdil. The person who has eaten or has tasted food can make Havdalah and can make Kiddush. So they're completely different opposites. One says they can, one says they can't. And there's no difference between Kiddush and Havdalah. In both cases, they can't. In both cases, either they can or they can't eat. The Gemara goes on. Amar Rava. The Rava makes a conclusion here. Hilchata tam mekadesh v'tam avdil. Rava, who's the generation below Rava, he comes along and says, "No, I'm going to make a clear distinction here." And the answer is, according to Rava, tam mekadesh v'tam avdil. The person who eats is allowed to make kiddush, and the person who has tasted food is allowed to make havdalah. He carries on, Rava, his expression, in this one statement that he made another point as well. He said, Misha lo kidesh be'erev Shabbat, and anyone who did not make kiddush on erev Shabbat, mekadesh v'holech kol hayom kulo, and someone who makes kiddush on erev Shabbat can carry on making kiddush all day, the whole day, meaning the whole day of Shabbat, ad motzei Shabbat, until motzei Shabbat. And Misha lo hivdil b'motzei Shabbat, and someone who hasn't made havdalah on motzei Shabbat, mavdil v'holech kol hashabbat kulo. He can continue to make havdalah the whole week. Shabbat here meaning week. That's the opinion of Rava. Amema learns the same thing, but he learns it slightly differently. He has different language, and it's important. The language is important here. Amema patachla. Amema opened his mouth and said, "Lahashmata." He opened the teaching of this particular statement the following way: the Rava, the Haidishna, and he used this language. He said, "Amar Rava," said Rava, Hilchata tam mekadesh tam mavdil, exactly the same, but then he goes on, it's slightly different. Misha lo kidesh be'erev Shabbat, mekadesh v'olech kol hayom kulo. So you can do it the whole day. It doesn't say ad motzei Shabbat, he just says the whole day. And Misha lo hivdil motzei Shabbat, mavdil v'olech kol hayom kulo. You should carry on the whole day. It doesn't say the whole of Shabbat. Now, there isn't actually any practical difference between these two opinions. But as we will see later, they were very, very particular on how they quoted things, because as you can see, a lot of these words are given interpretation, and many interpretations only hundreds of years later are given to these words. So they were very, very careful to quote exactly what was said. Maybe years later, someone will interpret the words ad motzei Shabbat. You never know. So it's important to quote it the way you've heard it. So when Amema was quoting it, he was quoting it the way he had learnt it, and similarly Rav Nachman was learning. Rav Nachman was learning it the way he'd learnt it, and the first rabbi in this piece of Gemara would also learn it, would speak it the way he heard it. You have to actually say it the way you've heard it. Now, moving on, this is a story about the two children of Rav Chisda. He had two children. They were both called Mister, both called Mar. So there's Mar Major and Mar Minor. Amrei Le Mar Yuanuka v'Mar Kashusha. So Mar Major and Mar Minor, they're like the elder and the younger brother. Berei the Rav Chisda, the children of Rav Chisda, Rav Ashi. They said this to Rav Ashi. Okay, Zimnacha da ikla Amema la'atrin. Amema once came to our neighborhood. Again, another story about someone coming to visit someone Surprise, surprise. It seems to be a theme. V'lo have lachamran. We didn't have any wine. Oy, oy, oy. Aitnina le shichra. So we gave him some beer. Okay, to make Kiddush. They gave him beer to make Kiddush. When they say beer here, and I will use the term beer because I generally translate it as beer, it's some kind of an alcoholic date beverage. They made it out, not out of barley, but they made it out of dates. And anyway, so they gave him this date wine, date beer. And he wouldn't make Havdalah. In fact, he fasted that whole night. He actually went to bed hungry that day. Lemachar, the following day, Tarachna, we made a real effort. And then we found some wine and we brought him some wine. And after that, he made Havdalah and he tasted a little bit. Lishna tu ikla, Lashana tu. Excuse me, Lashana, the next year, to Ikla Latrin, and in the following year he came again to our neighborhood. But exactly the same thing. We didn't have any wine because because we didn't have any wine. And we brought him again the beer, the same thing again. We brought him the beer the date beer to do Havdalah on. But this time, Amar, having been there once and seen no beer, twice and seen no beer, he draws a conclusion here. He says, Ihachi, if you never have any wine, if it wasn't just, I thought it was a freak event last year that you didn't have any wine. Fine. If you never have any wine, Chama Madinahu, then beer is your wine. This is your top drink. The important thing is not that we drink wine. The important thing is we drink your top drink. And if this is your top drink, this is your top drink. So he takes the beer. So that night he actually takes the beer and he actually drinks on the spot the beer so that he doesn't actually have to wait until the following morning like he had the year before. A very interesting principle that he's learned here, that it is place dependent. If your place happens to like beer, then or the beer is the main drink, then so be it. We can learn from this little story three things. Shmamina tlat. We can learn three things. We can learn Shmamina hamavdil b'tfilah tzarich shiavdil al hakos. Here, clearly he must have made Havdalah in shul, yet he still wouldn't eat until he'd made Havdalah. So therefore, we learn from that if you made Havdalah in shul, you still have to make Havdalah on the cup of wine or whatever it is. Shma mina, and you also learn from here, asur lo la'adam shochal kodem shiavdil, and then the obvious lesson here is that you're not allowed to eat until you've made Havdalah, presumably on the cost, so presumably on the cup of wine. And the third thing, shma mina, mi shelo hivdil b'motzei Shabbat, someone who has not made Havdalah on Motzei Shabbat, mavdil v'holech kol Shabbat kulo. He can continue to make Havdalah all week because we see in the story that Amema made Havdalah. Amema made Havdalah actually the following day. So from that we can learn that you can make it the following day. I actually think that they've made a conclusion which is a bit too big here. I don't think you can learn from this story that you can do it the whole week. What you learn from this story is you can do it on the Sunday morning. That's all you can learn. I would apply the principle of tafasta maruba, lo tafasta here. If you're trying to learn too much from here, you can't. But the Gemara seems to be happy with these conclusions, and it moves on to the next section. The next section goes on as follows. Ba minei Rav Huna me Rav Chisda. Rav Huna asks Rav Chisda a question. What's the question? It says, Maula Kedusha Yashika. Bearing in mind what we just learned, okay? Bearing in mind we learned the story of Amemar, and he says that you can sometimes do it on beer, or you can't do it on beer. What's the actual law? Maula Kiddush Shikra. What is the law about making Kiddush on date beer? So that's the question. Amar. And so his reply was, Rav Chisda's reply was, this is a famous question. I've been asking this question for years. It goes, Hashta umad pirzuma v'te'ene v'asme. He says, you're asking about date beer. I have already, on many occasions, all right, asked about barley beer that's made from hops. So that I've asked about normal beer. I've asked about fig beer. I've asked about a berry beer. I've asked about all these different types of alcoholic drinks made from various different fruits. The Bai Minei Rav, and I asked Rav this very, very question. For Rav had already asked Rabbi Chia, the generation above Rav. He'd also asked the question. For Rabbi Chia had asked Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Rabbi Chia had even asked the Tana Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, V'lo pashatle. Not even Rabbi Yehuda Nasi knew the answer to this question. He had not that way. He said he didn't know the answer. What it means is he could not find an excuse for saying yes. We know we're supposed to do wine. Are you allowed to do shichra? The answer is no. They couldn't find any excuse for doing it. And so he's saying, I've asked all these other ones. I've asked about barley wine, and I've asked about barley beer, and I've asked about fig beer, and I've asked about berry beer. Shichra mibaya, do I really need to ask now about date beer specifically? So basically he's saying, no, you can't make it. So and everyone drew the conclusion here, all right? Kiddushi hu delo makachinaleu aval avdulim avdilin. He said that this actually, if you look at the question, it's maula kedushe hashikra. The question that's being asked is, are you allowed to make kiddush on beer? And they're saying, and there were a lot of people came to the conclusion, having learned this thing, that just like you're not allowed to make kiddush on beer, so you're not allowed to make you're not allowed to make kiddush on beer, but nevertheless you are allowed to make havdalah on beer. That was what people thought. Amalahu Rav Chisda, but Rav Chisda said, no, wait. Hachi Amar Rav. This is what Rav said. Rav said when I asked Rav, he says, Kashem she'ein makdishin alav, kach ein mavdilin alav. Just like you don't make kiddush on beer, you shouldn't make havdalah on beer either. The Itay Manami, and there's another difference of it. There's a different way of learning this as well. There's a lot of principles here. They say the same thing, but they're using a different word. Amar Rav Tachlifa bar Avimi Amar Shmuel. We've just learned it in the name of Rav. Now we're learning Rav Chisda was learning it in the name of Rav. Now we're learning it in the name of Shmuel. Kashem she'ein makdishin alav, kach ein mavdilin alav. So it seems that both Rav and Shmuel, or there's difference of opinion who said it, but there does seem to be a very clear principle that there's no difference here between Havdalah and Kiddush, whether you're allowed to use beer. And in both cases, you are not allowed to use beer. Levi Levi sent to Rebbe, all right, a particular good beer. What did he send him? Shikra Batlesa Magane. It was a special kind of date beer which had been soaked 13 times in the dates to give it a really strong flavor. Rebbe had this, and he had Tameh, he tasted it, Vahave Basim Tova, and it tasted really, really good. It was a really good, tasty beer. It was lots of, what do they call them? They call them botanicals, I believe, when they're making a good beer or good gin, they put in these botanicals. And it had a particularly strong flavor, particularly strong botanicals in it. Amar, and he said, Kagon zeh ra'oi lekadesh alav. Something this good, this isn't just everyday beer, this is quality, artisan beer. This is suitable. Kagon zeh ra'oi lekadesh alav. You can make kiddush on this. This is fantastic. And you should actually make all the praises and all the songs in the world you can make on such a fantastic drink. He's actually making a big deal of this very, very drink. But he actually had some stomach problems that night. He really suffered. He had a really rough night after drinking that fantastic beer. And he says, Miasrin umafayas. He says, it makes you suffer. This beer makes you suffer. But it was worth it. He's basically saying it makes you suffer, but it also soothes you. So it does a bit of both. It's very interesting. The way you think this story is going to end is you think Matthias Umiyasrin. You think he's going to say, "Oh, this was great, but now I regret it." That's not what he's saying at all. He says it the other way around. He says, "Miyasrin, it made me suffer, Matthias, but it also soothes you." I think it was worth it. I think that's his bottom line, is that that even though he's going to suffer in the morning, it was worth having this particular botanical beer the night before. Amar Rav Yosef, talking about beer, they seem to have an aversion to this kind of beer for some reason. It was obviously a rough stuff. Most of the beer that they had was a rough stuff. Amar Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef used to say, "Edor barabim v'lo ashtei shikra." I'll make some kind of an oath that I cannot ever break, and I would make that oath that I can't break, right? Because if you make an oath in public, you can't go back on it. So he's saying, "Edor barabim," I'll go out publicly and say, I'll swear to God, I'm never going to drink beer. And if you're going to say, he said, I would be prepared to say that because I don't want to drink beer. Amar Rava said, Ishti mezurion v'lo ishtei shichra. He says, I would rather drink the water that they have soaked flax in before they make it, that disgusting goo that comes out after you've been soaking linen. But lo ashtei shikra, I would rather drink that than beer. Obviously, their beer was pretty rough. But Amar Rava said, Tevei shakyuta shikra man de makadesh shikra. He said, he's like a curse. He goes, anyone that makes kiddush on beer should be the only drink they ever drink, because they're saying it's such a low drink. So you shouldn't be used if you're going to make beer, or if you're going to make kiddush on beer, which is the lowest possible drink, then you shouldn't be able to make you should be cursed by having beer all the time. If you like it so much, have it all the time. Rav Ashkechei de Rav Huna, the Akadesh Ashichra. Rav found Rav Huna making kiddush on beer. Amar Lein, he said to him, I see your business is a success, because Rav Huna had actually been brewing beer. He'd actually opened a brewery, and he says, I can see that your brewery has been success. Share Abba la mikne istare meshikra. Now that you've started making some money from beer, I see that you're very happy with beer. It looks good in your eyes. You've taken a liking to beer because you're making money from it, and that must be why you're making kiddush on beer. Tanu Rabbanan, the Rabbanan have learned. This is an interesting way of learning. Yeah, this is an interesting way to finish it off. I would have put this on the other slide. There wasn't any room. Tanobanan, this is a piece of Tanaic material. This is a piece of material from the rabbis of the Mishnah, and they say, Ein mekadchin ela bayayin. You can only make kiddush on wine, ve'ein mevarchin ela bayayin, and you cannot make a bracha except on wine. So that's what they come out and say this. Obviously, we've just learned that doesn't necessarily follow through to the Amoraim, the idea of not making kiddush. If it's a special kind of beer, you can. But the thing they're bringing up here is Ein mevarchin el yain. You don't make a bracha on anything other than wine. Hang on, that doesn't make any sense. Atu da shikra ala maya. Are you telling me that on beer and on water, mi lo mevarchin alayhu she'akol niyeh b'dvaro? So you don't even make a bracha of she'akol niyeh b'dvaro on the Mecca. I understand you don't say Berei Pri Agafen, or you don't say Berei Pri Etz on these things, but you don't even say Shahakol on wine and on beer and on water. What's going on here? How can you say that? He goes, no. My bias says, no, you misunderstood. Ein mevarchin does not mean you don't make a bracha on it. Doesn't mean you don't make a bracha before you drink it. Of course you say shahakol. You don't say to your waiter, bring me a wine, bring me a glass so that I can make benching on it. Well, I'm going to make benching. I'm going to make a bracha on this. Don't bring me something to make a bracha over it. Ela ala yain. You only do that on wine. You can only ask the waiter to bring wine for the end of the meal. Wine bracha. That's the important thing. But Tanu Rabbanan, another statement which was said by the Rabbanin, Tanu Rabbanan ein makadshin al shecha. The Rabbanim, according to this bright, says you do not make kiddush on beer. Mishum Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon Amu Mekadshin. But Elazar Rabbi Shimon, this is the famous Rabbi Elazar who was in the cave with his father Rabbi Shimon. He used to say, you actually can make kiddush on beer. Said by a man who survived on water in Caribs for 13 years. So yes, he certainly would have been happy to have beer for Friday night. Okay, now before we move on, I just want to remind you, a couple of days ago we learned 7 different things from a statement in the Mishnah, a Mishnah statement, and one of them, which we're going to deal with now, I'm not going to go into all of them again. The fourth one was the person who makes the bracha for benching or for kiddush, he needs to taste a little bit of that wine before he goes on. The Gemara goes on now to discuss that one little thing quickly before we move on. And the first thing they say is, miteimaten yain, miteimet le yain. When you actually drink the wine or taste the wine, how much are we talking about? How much are you allowed to drink? And one opinion is kolshu. Kolshu means anything, just to taste, just the smallest minuscule amount that you can just get onto your lips until you have a taste. Kolshu, that's how much it is. Another opinion, Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says, no, malolugma. You have to have a cheekful. You have to have that's the minimum amount that you're supposed to have when you have kiddush. When you have kiddush, you don't just touch the wine with your mouth and taste it. It's not a wine tasting ceremony. You have to fill your cheek with wine in order to. That's what it means when it says you have to have a drink with your kiddush. That's how much you have to have. Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav, the Chentani Rav Gidel, the Mineresh. So there's an opinion here that Rav Huna bar Amar says in the name of Rav, and some people say that it was Gidel from Neresh that said this. And what did he say? Hamakadesh v'tam maleh lugma yatsa. Someone who drinks and makes kiddush and fills his cheek up with wine, he has managed to do his obligation. He's fulfilled his obligation, but if he doesn't, he hasn't fulfilled his obligation. Now, the Gemara goes on to ask about this Rav Gidel. This has nothing to do with the sugya at all, but it is to do with being precise. As we've seen in the whole Gemara, you've got to be precise in how you quote things. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, when I learned this, I didn't learn Lo Gidol bar Menashe. This Rav Gidol that we learned about, I didn't learn it was Rav Gidol bar Menashe. It wasn't this one who was Gidol son of Menashe. But Lo Gidol bar Manyumi, I didn't learn in the name of Rav Gidol bar Manyumi. Ella Gidol Stama. This is another Rav, or not necessarily another Rav, but when I learned this statement, it just said Rav Gidol. It does not clarify who this Rav Gidol was. And the Gemara asks, Lamai nafka mina. Who cares? What difference does it make? What difference does it make if it's Rav Gidol bar Menashe or Rav Gidol bar Manyume, Rav Gidol Stama? What difference does it make? And they say, Lememra didei adidei. What if you bring another statement that Rav Gidol says and they disagree with each other? You need to know exactly who says what. You can't just go by rumor. It's no good saying, oh, I've heard that someone says. Okay, and then you say, well, who says? Maybe someone else agrees. I have to say, this has been a theme throughout the whole of the daf. When you're talking about being precise in what you say, it's so important. People who learn Torah and have not learned Gemara very, very often say, oh, Chazal Omrim, or it says in the Gemara this, and this, and the other, and they don't tell you who says it, and they don't say where it's from. And in many, many cases, if the Gemara says one thing, it might say the exact opposite straight afterwards. So you really have to be sure who's saying what and how things fit together. Otherwise, you get a really messed up opinion. And you see that. You really, really see that. The way people keep halakha, the way people relate to Torah, they don't have a set opinion. You really have to be precise in who says what before you can make any conclusions. Okay. We're getting now to the bottom of Kuf Zayin Amud Aleph, and we are actually returning to our Mishnah. At the beginning of the Mishnah, remember we learned the very first Mishnah of the Perek. It says, Erev Psachim, Samuch LaMincha, Lo Yochal Adam Ad Shetechashech. And I learned this according to an opinion. We're going to now see whether I learned it right at the beginning of the Mishnah. The question is, Samuch LaMincha, which Mincha are they talking about? Okay. The question is this: if you look at the timeline, you've got 3 different minchas. I pointed them out at the time. There's mincha katana, there's plaga mincha, there's mincha gdola. Now we can be pretty sure it's not plaga mincha. That's really late in the evening. But let's look about mincha katana, mincha gdola. That's the question we're going to have here. Samuch la mincha gdola tanan. Are we learning that it's samuch la mincha gdola, which would mean that it starts before mincha gdola and goes all the way until the evening? You're not allowed to eat before Pesach. Is that what they're talking about? Or Dilma, or perhaps it's talking about Mincha Ktana, which means that you wouldn't be allowed to eat from about the 9th hour onwards, slightly before 9.5 hours. You're not allowed to eat. So which one is it? Now, those who haven't learned Gemara before should see this type of argument. They have this a lot in the Gemara, the or Dilma argument. You have one opinion, or Dilma another opinion, and then they come. This is a very, very formula way of explaining it now. What they do now is they go for the first side, or then they repeat it. Samuch la mincha gedola tanan. Did we learn it about mincha gedola? What would be the logic behind that? And then they explain the logic now. Mishum Pesach, because of the Korban Pesach. We're supposed to make the Korban Pesach in the afternoon. And if we're busy eating in the afternoon, Dilma ati lemimshach, maybe he's going to continue his meal. Maybe because he's eating his meal for such a long time, he'll forget to actually bring the Korban Pesach on Erev Pesach. That's the logic behind having the first opinion of Mincha Gdola. Or Dilma, Samuch la Mincha Ktana Tanan. Or maybe we've learned about maybe we're talking about the small Mincha Ktana, which is later on. And why would that be? That would be too late to be worrying about the Pesach. So what would it be? Or Mishum Matzah. That's because of the Matzah, which we're going to be eating in the evening. Dilma ati lemechle matzah lachila gasa. And if we've eaten all day and we come to eat matzah, then we're not even going to be hungry, and we're going to eat it in a kind of like rude and very base fashion. And in order to eat it in a more healthy fashion, that's why we have to stop eating from samuch lamincha ketana. So how can we resolve this issue? So look at the structure there, by the way, because this structure repeats itself when you have an or dilma this, or dilma that, and in both cases there's a mini dilma explaining what the logic is behind it. And we don't know. Dilma means perhaps, and we've got a good argument both ways. So now what we're going to do, we bring in another piece of opinion. Ravina brings an external piece of material in order to analyze it with. What's this external piece of material? Says Toshma. The rabbis have learned what this is talking about is here. This is another piece of Tanaic material. So Ravina, who is an Amora, is bringing a Tanaic piece of material, and he says this is what it says: Afilu Agrippas Hamelech, even King Agrippas, shehu ragil leechol b'teisha sha'ot, he typically ate at 9 hours. Even he, okay, oto hayom lo yochal ad shetechashach. He would normally sit down to have a meal at 9 hours, right? He would sit down and eat here, right? At 9 hours, he would sit down and eat. But even he, on Erev Pesach, wouldn't eat until, wouldn't eat at that stage until he would skip his afternoon meal, right? Which is an unusual thing for a king to do. And they go, the Amrat. So Ravina's carrying on here. Amrat, if you say Beshlama, and if Amrat Beshlema, if you say correctly, I mean basically he's saying, I think this is the right answer. If you say Samuch mincha ktana, if you say it's close to mincha ktana, tanan hainu rabuta d'Agrippas. If you're saying that it's close to mincha ktana, well, that's the greatness of Agrippas, because Agrippas, even though he didn't have to stop, because according to mincha ktana, he wouldn't have to stop before then, but he was such a great man that he stopped even earlier at 9 when he would normally have his meal. He stopped then. That's the greatness of Agrippas, and that's why they're telling the story. Ella, but if you were to go the other way and say it was to do with mincha gdola, in that case, then what's the greatness of Agrippas? He's just doing what he's supposed to do. You're not allowed to eat then. He didn't eat then, so why mention it? What's the big deal? So therefore, Ela samuch la mincha ktana tanan. So therefore, Ravina says, they definitely meant mincha ktana, which is the way I learned it at the beginning of the perek. They're talking about mincha ktana and not mincha gedola. The Gemara continues and says, wait a second. Sof sof ma ravuta lagripas hamachale is manisura. But what is the greatness of Agrippas? He can't start a meal on the 9th hour, because if he starts a kingly meal on the 9th hour, it's going to go over into the time when you're not allowed to eat. Samuch lamincha. He couldn't finish the meal in time. So there's, what's the greatness that we have here? And they say that the greatness of Agrippas is measured because Maudatema. You could have said Teisha Shaot la Agrippas Ka'alba Shaot Idan. For him, for his meal on the 9th hour is like everyone else eating their morning meal at the 4th hour. And because everyone fixes a meal every day on the 4th hour, and only a king fixes a meal at 9th, maybe just like we could eat at 4, he could eat at 9. And he goes, no. In fact, we don't learn that Kamash Manan, and because that we don't learn it, and that's the greatness of Agrippas that we don't that he did, that we don't even fix. He doesn't even fix his meal, even though it's his generally fixed meal. We will all eat at 4, but he would not even eat at 9. Okay, we'll leave it there for today. There's a little bit left on the daf, but it's more fitting to continue with that tomorrow.